As Jimmy watched through the glass, he was at a loss of words and his mouth had become much drier. He was struggling to take his eyes from it as he watched in fright. His face was burning and his lip was hurting from biting down onto it as he gambled his life for a second look at what was before him. The creature was laying inside and its eyes were dark black and large as soft balls, but pitch black. Jimmy could sense something of pure evil as he lowered his head, hoping not to be spotted by the strange beast. The creature seemed to be incubating inside the chamber and feeding on the red vials. Jimmy was close, hoping it didn't see him as he ducked to stay lower now and out of view of it. Jimmy could feel the sensation of the coldness in the area. It had made contact with him the second he lay his eyes upon the oddly figured mutant there before him. As he peered inside at the beast, he knew this was one of them. It was the voices he had been hearing. Suddenly the glass shattered as pieces flew at him in what seemed to be in slow motion as the undescribable figure lashed out and dug its large grisly nails into his arm. Jimmy fell onto his back as it latched on with an unstoppable rage, tearing into him as he screamed and fought back to get away, but its strength was too much for him. It wrestled him to the floor as it slammed his fingernails deep into his arm again, this time as blood and human muscle and tendons spewed across the floor, covering Jimmy's face as he nearly blacked out again. The extraterrestrial was ferocious as it began to drool and spit on Jimmy. Its teeth were razor-sharp and hollow like crystals, and could tear a man from limb to limb if it had the chance. As it clawed away to get Jimmy's face, missing him as he dug his shoes deep and pushed himself backwards, nearly escaping his own fate. The creature was growling with murderous desire as it lunged again at Jimmy, laying helplessly on the floor. Only thing protecting him was the shield he formed with his hands to block the alien from finally killing him. He was no longer screaming towards the beast, knowing he was alone. Jimmy clutched his fist as tight as it would allow him to. His hands were his only weapon as the creature went for the final pounce towards him as its teeth let out a blood-curdling cry, warranting Jimmy's death. Scrambling to gain momentum, Jimmy raised his arm up, still on the floor, leaning back as the creature landed into him. Jimmy made contact with the creature's face as he grabbed onto it in a split second. He made a hook with two of his fingers to rip the eye from the creature. He swung into the rageful beast, striking it with the hook as he dug it into its eye and ripped it from its face. A yellowish mucus began to pour from it, spurting and streaming from vessels. The creature swayed its arms in disbelief. It screamed as if it was burning with hatred, pain, and vengeance. Standing there reaching towards its open socket, it could see from its other eye that Jimmy had wounded it greatly. The yellow blood was pouring profusely as it began to turn into other shades of dark pus and fluids from within itself. It then lay on the floor with no fight left to attempt itself against Jimmy. It gave a horrible look back at him as Jimmy sat there wordless and grateful he was still alive. He knew this was just a baby compared to the others. He knew this by its size, but also with the thought he knew his life would be on the stakes if they found out. The voices were lost now. He no longer heard them, but wasn't going to take any more risks like the one he took here. He could see the creature as it lay dead, silent now, and motionless. It had the strangest of all skins, and its body was rough as sandpaper. This one wasn't wearing a bodysuit. It was wearing only its flesh. Its skin was a darkish green and blue, and it seemed to resemble a chameleon, the way its texture would change when looking at it from another angle. Its eye was still running out from the empty crater Jimmy had caused during their tussle. The eye was in shards just laying beyond Jimmy, and no longer was it recognizable as an eye. Looked to him as just another piece of flesh. But it wasn't. It was more than that. It was Jimmy's life. Jimmy defeated the impossible, and although he too had been gouged and bleeding from his arm, it was major. It wasn't major or life-threatening. He ripped a piece from his shirt and tied it around his arm as if it were a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. He would need stitches, but the mutant figure had missed the artery, so he remained calm as he could. Chapter 11. Chasing the Unknown. Billy Jones was outside and could see the Blanches from where he stopped his bike just yards away. They were feuding about Jimmy, and they seemed to be quite upset. Billy could tell because Jimmy's mother was being erratic and not listening to anything his father had to say. She suddenly smacked him directly on one side of his face. Drunk and staggering, he tried to calm her by chasing after her as she walked to her car. She didn't listen to any of his pleas to stay and wait. She slammed the car door and cranked it on the ignition. His father was on his knees beside the car, still trying to talk to her and make sense of it all, but she wound the window up even quicker. Then, without any hesitation, she pulled off, leaving him there on the driveway, crying to himself over Jimmy. Billy didn't want to see anymore. As he pushed his bike along the road, only stopping for a second to open the Blanche's mailbox to stick in a paper. Jimmy's father hardly noticed as he held his head in discomfort over the whole ordeal. Billy decided to stay quiet, getting back on his BMX as he wheeled off down the street. Shawl Road would never be the same now, and he knew it. And so did the rest of the town of Mansfield. Billy was rolling even quicker now on his bike, pulling a wheelie as he passed by the other lanes. He tossed newspapers as he sped through the scene of where Billy and Jesse had went missing, and kept moving so he could finish early. It was mid-afternoon now, and most of the residents in Mansfield seemed to be indoors as Billy rode by, watching the houses as he delivered the last bunch. Up ahead he could hear music, the kind of music a music box or ice cream truck would make. As he gained momentum on his bike, he could see it in the far distance. It was an ice cream delivery truck. It was heading towards him. As he paddled on, he could see a large cone on top of it that read, "Treat Yourself," in bold orange lettering. The truck was that of an old panel van converted into an ice cream delivery truck. It was white in color. From the distance, Billy could see it barreling quickly his way. The truck was still moving towards him as he pressed on the back handle brakes of his bike to slow down. The music was playing loudly, and oddly enough, it was distorting as it came closer. It sounded more like an eerie soundtrack twisted into a haunted tune of macabre. The evil sound grew as it neared him. Yards away, Billy could see the truck was speeding up and not looking to slow any as he faced it head on. The road seemed to get even darker as he came closer to the loud music. It was as if the street lamps along Shaw Road were dimming as he passed each one. He took notice they weren't on. It was still daylight, and it hadn't reached the evening hours yet. Some kind of darkness was closing in on him as the light faded. He could only see the truck ahead of him. Things were changing as he rolled towards the truck, and his perception of it had become wary, and he was now feeling cautious. Instantly, the truck seemed to rev its engine, causing black smoke to pour out from the back tailpipe. Billy became worried and skidded out on the back tire using the brakes, but the truck was still charging towards him. He didn't know what to do, limited with time. The truck fired once again as it bolted at him, with the kill being the only thing on its mind. If the truck had the capability of thinking, its dark intent would be of that. Billy Jones braced himself on his bike, feet away from the truck, directed towards him. Only a split judgment of anticipation would decide his life or death, or the possibility of his survival. Billy swerved his bike, using his legs to push it as if it were a scooter, trying frantically, hoping to get to the woods and from off the road. He quickly lunged in a desperate attempt as the front of the demonic truck struck him, smashing through him like a battering ram and tossing him from his bike, hitting the air as he soared uncontrollably, hoping to save his skin the very second the truck collided with him. The front of the possessed truck clipped the handlebars and threw his bike across the countryside as if it were just a weightless object. Billy's body rolled into the briars and into the dry, grassy area along the road. He rolled, coming to a halt, already knowing he had made it safely from the killing machine. Nervously, he leaned himself up with his arm balancing to see if the truck had kept moving. He stayed put, unaware of the ice cream truck, not knowing if it were still there or if it had left. Billy's jeans were torn, and his knee was scraped badly, but he wasn't losing much blood from it. He left it as it was, awaiting the truck as if it were still out just along the road. There was a large oak tree blocking him from seeing clearly into Shaw Road. Billy crept slowly and steadily, keeping himself low, using it to hide himself from the truck. He could no longer hear that disturbing tune that was playing from the ice cream truck. He felt the disadvantage between himself and the truck, and knew his odds were low if he had to go against it again. Billy's heart was pounding as he walked across some dry leaves, hoping not to make any apparent sounds. He was still using the tree, staying behind it as best as he could to get a better look out. His heart jumped heavily as he caught a certain glimpse of it. The truck had stopped just up ahead on the road. The air around him felt heavy and seemed to carry a weird chill that didn't help. He stood frozen behind the same oak tree, just watching the old panel truck that once carried creamy delights for children. It was no longer that truck. This truck was on a rampant thirst for blood, but there was only one question Billy pondered. Who was driving it? And why were they after him? Billy took a good look around by the truck and couldn't locate his bike, but sensed it was hardly worth the risk at getting at. He could hear the motor of the truck still sitting there motionless as an idol in the distance. Billy turned his head to look back behind himself and check for another route to escape the truck. Death had not escaped him. His jaw dropped as he looked back and noticed where he had landed in the dead end that had been blocked off just a few yards away. He could see postings tacked along the trees reading, "Danger, no trespassing." It was the valley below that had kept him there and from running in the other direction. The valley of canyons were as deep as 12 oceans and full of razor-sharp rock, which had already claimed many of the hunters' lives in the town of Mansfield. Billy heard the stories and knew there was just no way of making it down in one piece. Gathering courage, he thought of a plan and decided to go against the truck. His odds seemed to make more sense at the time. Billy didn't have a well-devised plan, but he knew time was running out and that the truck was still out there, plotting to kill him. He then reached down to tighten his shoelaces, preparing to run for it. He would run across to the other side of the road, hoping not to be seen by the satanic truck that played such horrible-sounding music. It was time. Billy jumped for it, knowing on the other side he had seen some farmhouses there before while on his delivery route. He quickly scurried into the road, only off a few yards from behind the back end of the ice cream truck. The back windows were jet black and tinted from seeing inside. He watched the truck being as quiet as he could, hoping his stealth was enough to get away. Billy had made it to the other side, and the truck hadn't moved, leaving him feeling better about his chances. He took a quick look again at the truck while reaching a tiny hill of grass made of dirted stone and old roots that overgrown from a tree that was cut down some time before. The engine blasted with a loud shot and then a smoky boom of carbon monoxide as the truck revved its gears until they grinded as if the motor was going to blow out from the hood. Billy was instantly startled as he tripped on one of the roots sticking out from within the unearthed ground ahead, twisting his ankle in the process and landing onto his chest, catching himself with his arms. The truck's music had came back on again, but even louder, more distorted than before. The truck missiled backwards towards Billy as its motor screamed like a chimney on a coal train. Billy picked himself up, leaving even more of his blood along the ground from his knee as he stumbled his way across a field. The truck was still behind him on the road as it slammed its brakes, stopping just below the small hill where Billy fell. Billy looked again and could see it there as the driver's side window slowly rolled itself down. He stood there watching, standing in the field of freshly cut corn and wheat straw. As he watched the window, he noticed there wasn't a driver inside. He rubbed the dirt from his face and took a harder look and could only see the normal instruments within a vehicle. Nobody was inside. He felt overwhelmed now by the fear he felt. Billy was confused over the strange truck, deciding to keep moving towards the old farmhouse ahead of him, which was within walking distance. Leaving the truck as it was, the truck's engine again fired loudly, as if it were angry at him, screaming off into the distance and not to be seen again. Billy could have sworn as it rolled away he could somewhat hear an evil laughter chuckling inside of it as it faded into the distance, but he wasn't sure if it was his imagination. Chapter 12. Saying Goodbye. Jimmy Blanche was still there, standing and bleeding by the bloody corpse. He then remembered, while falling through the tunnel, he must have dropped the sword-like object he found earlier in the dome room. He had killed one of the voices with his bare hands, but could it be done again? He questioned himself. He then searched around where he had landed earlier after blacking out from the fall. He couldn't find it. It must have been left behind the door where he was sucked in by the forcefulness of the portal. The area he was in was dark and seemed to never end. Only those chambers were there from what he could see. He couldn't see if there was any walls or end to where he was. Spaceless and dingy. The place was so spaceless and dingy, there wasn't any sound or anything that could be heard but himself as he continued looking for the teeth sword he so desperately needed. As he made his rounds, he glanced into some of the other chambers to assure himself there would not be any more of those things to attack him. Jimmy's eye was still leaking pus from the drill that had injured him earlier, and his arm was no better. The tourniquet around his bloody forearm was now saturated in his blood, and he could feel an infection coming on by the way it tingled inside. This had caused him to worry. He needed to find a more effective way to fight off anything that would try to stop him. He thought again about the last dream he had, the one with Jesus there. It helped him cope with the pain. He then sat down on the floor in the need of a short rest to get a grasp of what had just happened. He began to conjure a plan again on the bloody surface of the floor as some of the blood there soaked into the legs of his jeans. He didn't care. He was already bleeding and tired from the battle and how it left him. Suddenly he heard a muffled cry, but it wasn't distinct, leaving him on edge yet again. Not knowing where it came from filled him with terror and made him a bit nervous to look around for it. Again the noise broke and echoed for a second, bouncing off of the spacelessness of the place that had no walls, at least from what he could see. It didn't sound like a cry this time. It sounded more like a plead, as if somebody was dying. Still, Jimmy didn't trust anything here. He had nothing to lose, keeping his mind only on himself, or did he? He garnered his emotions while holding on to his bandaged arm. He decided to find the sound he had heard. Jimmy stood up, causing the blood on his jeans to trickle off into a small pool. The blood streams connecting itself with the rest of the blood along the floor as he began a search of the noise. He heard the sound yet again as it faded silent before he could catch it. Jimmy stepped closer to some of the chambers placed alongside of each other in the weird place that left him lost. Most of them were empty, and some of them had the same vials of blood sitting inside of them, which he believed was what the voices fed from to recharge themselves. The chambers were all shut and encased with the same kind of glass as before. He spotted far from him there was one that seemed to be partially open. Jimmy didn't rush to see, but knew someone or something was inside. He could see the glass lid was busted and propped up just enough. He could see from where he was as it shook lightly and then did so again a second later. He was worried that his mind was playing some sort of mind trick on him. After all, he has been through hell since arriving. Walking over cautiously to see inside, he could see fingers poke themselves out from the slim opening between the lid and the chamber. They looked human, but he was still having a hard time seeing them clearly in the dim light the area provided him with. He didn't hear any more sounds coming from within, and knew it could be a trick. He wasn't sure how smart the voices were, but knew they couldn't be trusted. Jimmy slowly reached the chamber, but wasn't ready to look inside just yet as his heart pounded in anticipation. He kept his face low, as before, ducking behind the side of it, noticing the fingers were no longer sticking out. He could see the tiny space where they once were, but waited to see if they would come back out again. And they didn't. He was there beside it, and in an instant he heard a moan within the chamber. "Oh, help!" The voice of somebody struggling seemed to be in there, but Jimmy didn't know the voice as it sounded. It was weak and very faint, but he could tell it wasn't the same kind of voices he heard in the dome room. He decided if it were a human, then if it were him, he would appreciate the help, so he quickly gathered his instincts and stood up to see inside of the chamber. By his surprise, he found Jesse inside, cut deeply and bleeding from his neck. He was there holding pressure among himself, knowing he was cut severely. His hands were drenched and stained with blood as he shook uncontrollably. Jimmy knew Jesse didn't have long and didn't want to see his friend go into shock. But Jesse was already out of it and didn't realize Jimmy was standing there watching. His body was shaking and his hands were weakening as the blood came through them. Jimmy stood there with tears flowing from his blood-covered face. His face was covered in grime and also stained with blood and sweat as he knelt down beside his friend. He didn't see what caused Jesse so much pain, but didn't want to make things harder for himself as he knelt there crying softly by his best buddy. Jesse managed to stay alive until now, but only had minutes before he would be gone. Jimmy wiped his tears one last time to say goodbye to his dear friend and whispered into Jesse's ear he loved him and would kill the bastards who did this to him. Jesse then closed his eyes as he seized into a forever death. But as he passed, he looked peaceful and had a short smile as he winked off into the unknown. Jimmy didn't know if Jesse heard him or not, but felt better knowing Jesse would no longer suffer his injuries. It tore him apart seeing him like that. He felt sickened by it as he paused one last moment to say a prayer for Jesse. Jimmy ran and ran until he passed by many of the chambers. There were hundreds of them. It seemed to never end. He ran trying to seek an ending to the place, but after 2 hours of running, he was exhausted and still hadn't found a way out. He couldn't run any longer. His legs were hurting badly now, and he already had to make many stops to catch his breath. He wasn't sure if it were day or night, or if it were night or day. There were no windows or ways to see out. The only light inside was coming from tiny portholes in the roof. The roof, if it was one or not, looked to be miles high and just as broad as the rest of the endless place Jimmy was trapped in. He continued to jog but had trouble keeping a decent pace. His shoes were cutting into him and his ankles were swollen and welted with sores. He realized walking was his only choice if he was to conserve energy, so if he did so, he'd walk on for another hour. He had never walked so far in his entire life on land, but in the short amount of time spent here, he had done so. He had done something he had never felt was possible for himself. He realized it was his drive to survive, and his faith was pushing him to succeed, to see his family again. Even if his family had problems or was dysfunctional, he needed them as much as they needed him. It took him this long to finally see it, but he knew now. He was drained emotionally and physically, in dire need of water or a drink to keep pushing on. His mouth was dry and his stomach was in pain as he slumped over, still fighting himself to keep moving. He was slowing and his legs were now like thin wires holding him up. He was having a hard time seeing now, and his body was close to shutting down from the lack of water as he dragged himself further into the never-ending space beyond. He was a brink away from collapsing and letting go of his only thing left. His life was failing him. If he couldn't find water soon, the spaceless place would be his doom, and he would rot there until his bones decayed into a mess of grain. He could only think this as he fought to stand. He then fell over and spread out along the floor of the place he felt was worse than hell itself. Jimmy closed his eyes, breathing heavy, while his blistered mouth burned from the lack of moisture. He had nothing left as he nodded off into the land of his own, where dreams were the only source of his survival. Chapter 13. The Eagle. Billy Jones had reached a farmhouse, but it was closed up and boarded over, and all the windows were broken out. He didn't wait long to check if the door was unlocked. He walked over cautiously and grabbed a hold of it to realize it, too, was locked over with a padlock and chain. He was baffled what to do next, knowing the street down below was too dangerous to try after what happened with the driverless truck. He searched along the house and found a big rock laying in the grass where there used to be a garden. The garden since then had died over and become a mess of overgrown weeds and wildflowers. He would try the rock and use it to smash the lock. If it didn't work, he knew he was going to be dark in no time. Daylight was burning quicker now, and he could still feel the coldness from earlier on his legs, but it wasn't as strong as before. He lifted the rock above his head with both arms as he swung it with the greatest force he had ever used and busted the lock from keeping him inside. The old rusted chain fell to the ground as he slipped his hand in to push the door the rest of the way open. The door hinges were rusted as well as it creaked open. He slid himself inside to get out of sight. He looked down as he entered the room and found a pack of matches that were still dry and useful, so he put them into his pocket of his dirty jeans. He then walked further into the room and could see nobody lived there for some time. The place was old and had old furnishings and furniture. The furniture was torn and sliced, and some of the stuffing was coming out of it as if something bad had happened here at one time. There was an old wood stove there that sat unused, but the front of it was open and had something laying inside. Billy went towards it and took it out, noticing it was an old toy wagon. He wondered why somebody put it inside, and if they did it out of spite. There wasn't any pictures left hanging on the walls of the old house, just the stains from where they once hung. The wallpaper was peeling in all directions and had a nasty color to it, but was once a floral design. The place was creepy and made Billy feel open to harm as he looked around, making his way to the next room. He wanted to call his roommate Tim and have him come for him, but there didn't seem to be a phone, and if there was, he doubted it would have a connection. Reaching the other room, he could see it was at one time a child's bedroom. It still had a small single-sized bed there inside. It too was older and had an iron headboard. A dresser sat there along with it, with a handful of knickknacks on top. Billy took one of them and placed it into his other pocket. It was a bald eagle, which reminded him of his father that had died 3 years earlier. His father was a skilled hunter, and he always carried a special love for the eagle. Billy was fond of this one and decided he would put it on his dresser if he were to make it back home. He then left the room as it was and decided to go back outside and see if there was a barn. If there was, maybe they left a car. Billy didn't have a license and mostly kept to 2 wheels, but didn't have his bike now, so it seemed like a smart thing to do. Before Billy left the house, he slowly peeked out from the door to double-check his coast was clear. He then slid outside, sticking close to the house, walking along the siding not to be seen. He knew weird things were going on and didn't exactly know what it was about. He just knew that the truck was driving alone and was being controlled by something other than a man or woman. That something he couldn't make sense of, but feared him greatly. He made it to the rear of the house and to his surprise spotted a barn just down below where he stood. He followed the trail that was mostly made of dead grass and dirt, and it was matted down over time from others timelessly walking over it. Reaching the barn, he could see it too was hit hard by years of harsh wind. Various weather. The barn was dull reddish color and had 2 humongous doors in the front that were closed but seemed to have enough room to get in. Billy crawled over top of the board, holding the doors, and squeezed himself into the barn to get a look. He could see the barn was no better off than a house, but there was a great deal of junk sitting around. There wasn't a car or any special barn finds such as a classic hot rod like he was hoping for, but the place wasn't useless to him just yet either. He searched the junk piled up along the wall and could see many non-functional car parts strewn about. Some old umbrellas were stacked against the wall as well, and not much else in that corner, so he went to the other side of the barn. A black bag that looked to be full of tools laid there beside a rusty tire pump and some weathered tire patches. Billy continued looking along the ground but didn't see anything he could use. He then peered up into the upper level of the barn and could see other things, but needed to find a ladder to get up top and see. Across the barn he seen there wasn't a ladder, but somebody had nailed smaller boards up along the side to be used as steps. Once he was up there, he could see an old Schwinn with balloon tires. It was hung up like it was somebody's prized possession at one time many years ago. The tires were intact, but over time they were left flattened. All of the air must have dissipated from them as it sat up there. The bike was rusted badly, but everything else was still there. Even the chain was on the sprocket correctly. This gave Billy some hope. He thought to himself, if the pump he found down below still worked, he could possibly ride this baby home. He didn't care either way, he was going to try. Back down on level ground, Billy attached the pump and began to lift the handle and push it down desperately, hoping for it to fill the old tires. He could hear the air blowing into them as the tires began to lift and raise up with each push of the pump. It was a success. The bike was holding up and the tires seemed to be strong enough. Billy then pushed the bike towards the front of the barn and lifted up over the board holding the doors. It was heavy as he lifted it. His BMX was many times lighter, he thought to himself, as he also climbed out to retrieve the Schwinn-style bike he had discovered. Once outside again, Billy pushed the bike up a small dirt path that led back to the house. He then slowly rolled it into the field where the truck had chased him earlier. He sat down onto the Schwinn and began his way towards the silent road ahead, where he could see no other passing motorists or any sign of help. Shawl Road was only a few yards away from the field as he pedaled cautiously, aiming for a long ride home. With no exceptions, he would risk his life on a half-rotten pair of balloon tires and an antique bicycle he had never ridden on before. Mansfield was turning quick. The coldness had taken over half of the town, and nobody seemed to notice. The warmth was cooling above them, and the streets were only half as warm as they were. People were being controlled by whatever it was that held on to them. The markets were emptier than before, and the grocery stores in town were pretty much abandoned. Everyone was calling off from work and leaving their duties in the hands of the coldness, Only a few were able to see what was going on. Even the news reporters and the police that were searching for the boys seemed to forget why they even started looking. They were strangely driving around and ignoring their radios, only stopping when the coldness allowed them to. The few people who weren't affected by the coldness locked themselves into their homes and didn't come out at all. They stayed in there and wanted no part of the secret cold that had taken over the town of Mansfield. Even Jimmy's father was acting stranger than before. Mr. Blanche had driven to an old gas station just off the old town highway and purchased 2 cans of gasoline. As oddly as it was, and sat them in the back seat of his car. He didn't say anything to the clerk, but even the station's clerk seemed surprised by Mr. Blanche's reaction when he asked him what the cans of gas were for. He didn't answer him. He just stood there with a cold grin peering back with darkness and a sinister gleam at the guy. The clerk noticed Mr. Blanche's face, how cold it looked. His face was red and blushed as if he were in a freezer for some time. The gas clerk also could see how different he was moving. His body looked stiff and almost frozen-like as he turned towards his car. The gas clerk stood there looking in fright, never seeing him act so strangely before. When Jimmy's father pulled back around, he stopped by the door of the gas station. He got out and opened the back door of his sedan and took the gas out. The clerk was watching from inside, freaking out as he watched. That's when Jimmy's father opened each can and started pouring the gas all over himself. He didn't stop there either. That's when he attempted to use a lighter he had in his pocket, but couldn't get it to spark right away. Good thing 2 teenagers were walking by at the time and jumped on top of him before he could do so. If it wasn't for them, he would have burnt to death for sure. Nobody knew the whereabouts of Jimmy's mother, so at the time she wasn't even notified of her past husband's behavior. Also, the authorities were called, but for some reason they never showed up to take a report on the incident. The town has been under a lot of duress lately, with 2 teenagers gone missing, and since then they haven't been found or located. One farmer was plowing his fields and thought for a moment he had found one of the 2 teenagers' bodies in the grass just below where he was plowing. That's when he spotted something that looked to be either Jimmy or Jesse, but here to come, it was just a mutilated cow. The weird thing about it wasn't one of his cows. It was one of Jed Winfrey's from his flock, but how in the world did it get 10 miles down the road and into his field? He couldn't figure out the slightest clue. Chapter 14. Monsters and Demons. Jimmy woke this time. He hadn't had a dream nor a nightmare, but he felt much more energized now. He was aching and sore, but felt okay. Before he could get up, he was grabbed by his throat. Jimmy gasped as he tried to get oxygen, but he was startled by what he saw in front of him. The creature stood 10 feet in height as it lifted Jimmy by his throat with its curled fingernails, slicing into him as it held him at eye level. Its face was that of an alien being, but 1,000 times more vulgar and much more powerful than the last. It was mutated, and its face was rough and covered in disturbing tumors. The tumors were oozing and dripping some kind of putrid-smelling pus. They also had long thorns growing from them. The creature was horrifying and scared the life from Jimmy as it held him there, just reading his every thought as if it could. 10 feet from the ground, Jimmy's legs were squirming and kicking as he lacked oxygen in the hand of the unimaginable. An unimaginable that only Satan himself could create in his nasty world of trickery. Its arms were unexplainable, massive, and you could almost see through its skin and watch its muscles grow into even more muscles as it flexed its arm holding Jimmy. Jimmy was trying to breathe, but the grip was lethal, awaiting the monster to crush his throat with one instance of a clasp. Unimaginable being was growling and spitting upon him with growing hatred as it despised of him. The spit was burning into Jimmy's cheeks, sending a painful sensation through him he could barely bear. He wiggled in the massive arms of the thing and could only see its monstrous mouth opening before him, readying itself to divulge Jimmy's body whole. Jimmy could see its throat as he struggled in its hand. It was contracting into another billion little sharper teeth. He was near his final breath, suffocating towards death within the jagged nails of the strange being. Jimmy screamed as loud as his limited air supply would allow him to do so at the hellish beast. "Take me, motherfucker!" The mouth of a billion knives. and more than 100 great whites had opened at its furthest point and lashed down into Jimmy, taking Jimmy's head and torso completely into its factory of chainsaw-like teeth. It lowered its jaws heavily into him, taking his body and neck cleanly off as blood drained from his corpse, still 10 feet in the hand of the unimaginable creature. His legs fell to the ground, severed from the rest, as they too bled in front of him. Jimmy was gone. But the two friends were now destined to see each other, as the beast vanished into the spacelessness. The coldness was just too much for them. Chapter 15. First Letter. Riding on the darkened road, day had become night as Billy Jones pushed towards home to see Tim. The Schwinn was rolling along, although it wasn't the sweetest bike. It was cutting good time for Billy. He had his hands tightly around the handle grips as he rode along on Shawl Road. The road was darker now, and up ahead he could see a strange greenish mist covering the street. The cold air was back, and as he rode he could see everything was starting to ice over. The trees hanging over the road were damp and starting to form ice driplets along the once colorful leaves. The street was also slicker and starting to look much colder as he rode closer towards the strange mist. The sun was still up, but it didn't matter. The coldness had shown its strength, and the sun was at no match for it. Billy didn't hear any birds or animals, or anything if that, just dead silence. It spooked him a bit as he rode on, hoping to see Tim and tell him about the truck that tried to kill him earlier. He thought about the truck and knew it could be around any given turn, but didn't want to imagine another chase. When he arrived to where he saw the mist, it had left. It must have moved, so he kept tracking his way on the ancient Schwinn that may have just saved his life. He passed the Blanche's house once more, but nobody was outside as he kept staring to see if Jimmy's father was inside. He did notice that the front screen door had been busted off and laying in the lawn. He didn't stop to investigate. He was ready to make his way home. He thought to himself as he rode about the knick-knack, the one he stashed in his pocket earlier. The eagle now reminded himself not only of his father but of himself as well. As he cranked the speed up, pedaling harder on the Schwinn, he felt as if his body were an eagle soaring through the sky at unstoppable speeds. He was no longer just Billy Jones. He was part of his father, and it didn't matter that he was gone or how he died or why he left Billy the way he did. All that mattered was he could sense him that very minute as he raced down Shawl Road. He could feel the blood come back into his heart that second, and knew that his reason was much bigger for being here than he ever knew before. He wasn't the same guy that graduated a few years before, when he was remembered as the pimply kid who could do really neat bike tricks and stunts. He wasn't the same guy that took his cousin to prom either, or the nerdy tall kid with framed glasses. He was more, much more. He had the eagle on his shoulder now, and it felt great knowing he wasn't alone. Billy arrived back at Tim's place, the home they shared together, where Billy stayed on the second floor of the brick home. He was excited to see Tim, and he was grateful that he hadn't ran into the truck again, making it home as it became night. Using the key under the doormat where Tim kept it since the time he was married, he went inside to find the house empty and Tim gone. The place looked the same, but there was one thing that was changed. The couch was covered in clothing. Tim's church clothes were piled up in a way as if he was there moments before. His belts and shoes also sat along with them, and even his wallet, which was strange, Billy thought. Why would he leave his wallet out? And his stuff? There had to be a purpose for it. It just wasn't like Tim to do that. He was the kind of guy that if you left something out, he would take it amongst himself and put it back for you. A real regular Joe who kept his things organized and out of the reach, so finding things out of place was not practical for him. Billy went through the house, and when he got to the kitchen, he could see a letter sticking to the fridge under a magnet. It wasn't like Tim to write anything for him, even if he was leaving or going out, so Billy walked towards it to open it up. He reached for the magnet to lift it from the letter, but suddenly he heard a car pulling up, and it seemed to be out front of the house. He walked quickly towards the closest window to see who had pulled up, crossing his fingers and hoping it wasn't the evil truck from earlier. It wasn't. It was Tim's ex-wife, but she didn't seem to be quick about getting out of her car. Billy had only met her once before, so he knew who she was, but was never engaged in a conversation with her. He thought about going outside to greet her as she sat in her car. Wasn't sure if Tim would like it if he did, since he kept that kind of thing private. And since they weren't together any longer, Tim didn't really allow her to come inside after the rough separation they had. Billy Jones remembered the letter he was about to read and left the thought of her as he walked back into the kitchen for the second time. The letter was folded up and put inside an envelope. As he took it from the fridge, he used his thumb to open it. He could see the letter was folded, but didn't open it just yet. As he held the envelope in one hand, he read the initials, B and J. So he knew it was intended for him. Billy then opened the letter to read it, but all it said was, "Going away." Billy then figured to himself that was the reason for Tim's clothes on the couch and why they were there. He must have been in a rush. Billy then put the letter back onto the counter before he walked into the other room, noticing from out the window Tim's late wife was still sitting in her car. She was still inside as if she were waiting for something or someone. Billy knew that Tim wasn't going to be home anytime soon after reading the letter, so he would go outside and tell her. As he closed the front door, stepping outside, he walked towards the car she was in. It was a silver Ford Escort and was missing the back hubcaps on the side as he approached it. The car looked to be through a lot and was probably on its last breath. It looked to him like another toaster on wheels. He made it to her side of the car. Her window was rolled up tight and she was staring ahead as if she didn't even see him there. Billy knocked lightly to pursue her and give her the news that Tim had left already. She didn't even blink as he knocked for a second time. Her face was staring away as if she was mesmerized by some unknown force. He tried the door handle, but the safety lock was on, keeping the door from opening. Billy was starting to worry now, and his chest was heavy, and he began to feel a bit disoriented. He walked around to the front of the car to see if she had noticed him by now. She hadn't. Her face was glued on something. He could see her stillness as she sat there in the parked car. The engine was off now, but she remained there, isolating herself in the coldness. Billy just watched her for a short moment. In that very second, her body began to shake and tremble uncontrollably. He could feel the handle get colder as he let go, in an attempt to find another rock to bust the window. There wasn't any rocks laying nearby, so he ran up to the front of the house where a shovel was propped up along the side where Tim had been working on a flower garden the day before. He grabbed it as he panicked. His chest was on fire from the anxiety he was feeling as he dodged towards the car yet again. He swung into the window behind her, hoping she wouldn't catch the shower of glass as he struck it with all his might. The window seemed to explode into tiny fragments as he made contact with the shovel, inches away from the back of her head. It was closer than he anticipated. She still sat there in the bucket seat as if nothing had happened, just a blankness expression upon her face. It was no longer shaking or trembling. Her body was still as of before. The shaking hadn't lasted long. Whatever it was had come and went already. Billy reached in through the frame of the busted window and grabbed her shoulder. Her shoulder was as cold as ice, and her hair had frozen into the back of the seat she was in. She didn't talk or make any signs of noise. She remained there as she was. Billy realized there was nothing he could do to help her or awaken her from the state she was in. He had a good feeling that the coldness had something to do with her being the way she was. Billy went back into the house, hurrying for the phone, but couldn't find it. The hook on the wall was there, and the cord had already been split for some reason. He checked under the couch for it and all of the other bedrooms, but it didn't matter. The phone was gone and nowhere in sight. There wasn't another neighbor for a mile, and he wasn't going to risk the truck again. It was dark and way too dangerous to go out now. He took another look out of the kitchen window and could see her the way he had left her. She was out of it, and from the look of it, her mind was gone and lost. Who knew if she would ever be the same? Billy didn't know what to think. He poured a glass of milk from the fridge and stood there in the quietness, just thinking even harder, and then contemplating where Tim could have went to. Billy was alone yet again. The same feeling he had when he arrived at the old farmhouse earlier crept back into his gut. He felt alone, but didn't want to give in to his doubts about the things he had seen that day. They were true, and there was no denying it or what he had seen. The letter from before was laying on the counter by his milk as he picked it up. He folded it even smaller, stashing it into his back pocket. He went into the parlor room and noticed that the door to the basement was open as he passed the hallway. The door had been shut since he moved in with Tim. It's where they kept the pantry cabinets and all the canned goods. But since he could remember, the door had always been hitched, with the tiny sliding lock above the handle. This time it wasn't, and that irked him in a weird way. Slowly he walked up to it and entered the doorway, heading downwards into the darkness. There wasn't a light in there, and it was even darker now. Billy decided to head back up after taking a few steps in so he could retrieve something for light. But then he caught himself remembering the pack of matches he had found at the old farmhouse on Shawl Road. He took them from his pocket and struck a single match as it burned bright and lit a small area in front of him. He crept down into the dusty basement to see if anything was moved or taken. The match suddenly blew out, causing him to be nervous, even more than he was. He tried hard to find another match in the pitch darkness, tearing it from the pack. He struck it once again as it fizzled out into his hand. He threw it down in front of him, although he couldn't see, becoming more annoyed with the matches than himself. He could smell the burntness of the last match. He wondered if they somehow have gotten wet. He tried once again, quickly tearing another and striking it almost in one motion. It lit up brighter than the first. As he made it to the last step down and hit ground level, he was shocked and horrified by the sight. His body tried to back away, but his legs were moving closer, as he couldn't see as well as he needed. Just a foot or two away, he could see something swinging slightly, hoping it was just some wet laundry as it rocked from side to side as if a breeze had entered when it came down. The basement was full of strange shadows, and everything was covered with plastic tarps that made it seem much more dreadful being down there. As Billy inched his way towards the darkness, seeing only what the tiny match would allow, he could only see whatever it was hanging from the roof of the room. His curiousness had grown to even greater lengths. He leaned forward in the dark and seen before his uncertain eyes, losing all of the breath. He felt punched in the stomach as if he were going to faint. The sight was horrendous as he bit the side of his mouth, tasting blood. Billy dropped onto his knee, holding his face, lacking to understand. He was crying and felt stupid for leaving when he did. His hands were shaking as he coughed and tried to catch his emotions, but they were too far gone at this point. Tim's body was hanging by the throat and by one of his leather belts. He was right. He had gone away. Chapter 16, Ghostly Visits, Watering Hole. 10 miles north of Mansfield, the town of Beasley, just outside of Ohio, had heard much of the news reports and had heard all sorts of bizarre rumors circulating about the small town and its people. Mansfield had been blocked off by government officials, and nobody for any reason had permission to leave. Their civil rights were only granted from inside the walls, and that's where they would stay until there's an evacuation in place. The U.S. Army had set up snipers and other gunmen at all the town's exits. All points of entering and exiting were closely watched and barricaded to keep the residents of Mansfield in their view. Soldiers had lined up around the line of their jurisdiction and were also wearing gas masks and were armed with semis. The town was now being brought forth into the public as a possible national risk. Anyone who tried to leave the restricted points would be shot or executed on the spot. The town wasn't just being targeted by the Army, but also the National Guard and the Air Force as well. Even the president had prepared a speech for the tiny forgotten town and had made a public announcement that all residents of Mansfield, no matter how important or powerful, remain in closed doors after 9 p.m. Breaking any of the rules that applied could be destined for serious injury or death by the hands of the U.S. troops. The old-timers who spent most days at the pub were forming groups and talking of taking things into their own hands. The pub was now not just a place of drinking, it was becoming a hot spot for hunters as well. These were the residents who weren't affected by the coldness that spread out over their entire town. They were growing impatient and wanted answers. One of the patrons, named Lily Jean, had taken part, bringing in her father's guns and all of the ammo she could gather after she found him dead the day before. She had went into his bedroom that day after he told her he had caught a bad flu. He told her the summer's flus were the worst, and he had surely gotten it. He never locked the door at night. The town was safe as they knew it. Well, that was before the coldness came down and blanketed the world like a plague straight from the devil's book of torturous spells. The day she found her father, she was just doing her daily routine, checking in on him and her mother. But after he told her he was feeling ill, she became a little worried since she hadn't heard from him all that afternoon she made her first trip. She darn near died seeing him there the way he was. He had slitted both of his wrists and shot his wife with the gun her grandfather had given her. 2 bullets for 2 loved ones, leaving behind their beautiful daughter, Lily. Lily Jean didn't live with her mother and father. She had a trailer out there on her parents' property, but she came and went often, having suppers with them, and she read the paper with her father in the morning hours, while drinking the coffee her mother would brew. Her father would have his smokes, and she would just shoot the breeze with him. Her father was in his late 60s, and her mother was just a few years senior of him, but now they were gone. Lily won't forget the father and daughter moments they shared together. She was a little closer to him, but loved her mother equally. Lily was an only child, but had one stepbrother she hadn't seen since she was 12. He didn't live there in Mansfield. Lily never moved away. She stayed put and liked it there. To her, it was home. And it's where she kept her heart, and if somebody described her, they would say she was a country kind of girl. Now at 34 years, Lily would tell you the same as she would have told you then. She always spoke what she felt and didn't mind being outspoken. She kind of had that smart-ass side of her, if you know what I mean. Lily Jean mostly dressed in tight jeans and cowboy boots. She started the trademark when she was just a young girl riding horses out at her parents' farm. She didn't date much, though she had the looks and had many of the guys around town chasing after her. She wasn't really interested in all that. She worked on the farm and took care of her parents' flowers around the yard. Most would say she was pretty ordinary and somewhat average, and that about sums it up. There Lily was, now sitting inside the pub beside Roger. Roger Goodens. He had a crush on her since he was a kid, but she never gave him the time of day. He still tries now and then just to get shot back down. She brought a pile of guns in, carrying them in a military bag her father had laying around in the back room, where he kept most of his fishing poles and guns, ammo and stuff like that. She had only been in there for a couple minutes before she called for a round of beers on the house for everyone inside. The guns were in a sack sitting by the 2. It didn't bother anyone. Most were already packed with mace and other weapons of their own choice. She received some hollers over the free drinks and waved. "This is in honor of my father," she called out. Some had heard the news and didn't give her one look or thank you over the angst of what her father had done. Some of the old-timers already knew about the mass suicides and deaths taking place. On another note, some of the even heavier drinkers really didn't give a damn either way. They weren't there to socialize like the rest. They were there to get shit-faced. Lily Jean gave Roger a small kiss on his cheek and thanked him for always being kind to her, even though they had never dated or went out as a couple. He smiled at her and told her he was sorry about her parents and everything else that might be bothering her. But she didn't say anything back. She didn't do that. But the thought of her father just left her soul feeling lost. She told him she brought the guns in because she wanted to hand them out. Wanted to hand them out to anyone who didn't have one. She felt that things were hitting the fan and used her father as an excuse, knowing he would have never done such a thing if it weren't for the strange plague of coldness that seemed to be circulating around the entire town. Roger's eyes grew wide as he replied back to her. "Are you crazy?" She smirked and said, "Here, this one is for you." He wouldn't take it at first until she forced it onto his lap. "Damn it, girl. Do you know what's going to happen if you give these guns out to regular people? People that have never fired one before?" Roger cried, looking into her eyes. She knew he was right, but donating the guns seemed like something her father would have done if he was alive and facing such an outcome. "Roger Goodens, I know you're in there somewhere, because I see you in front of me," she said back, getting frustrated by him and what he had said. "I want to help the town. I can't lose this one. I have already lost my parents, and I need to know you're with me on this," she asked. Her face was red now, and she wasn't going to simmer until he answered her. "I am. I always am, and you know that." Roger answering her back, knowing she was upset and had the right to be. Roger knew Lily needed him now more than ever. Roger slid the gun into his belt and put his shirt down over it so it was concealed and out of view. Lily then quickly stood on top of the pub stool, holding a small caliber pistol as she crawled up onto the bar. She was about to make the announcement and wanted to have everyone's attention when she did, so she took a mug of beer which was sitting by her foot and tapped the gun in her hand against it. The sound it made was that of a dinner bell, as if dinner was ready to be served. But this time it wasn't dinner, it wasn't food being offered, it was firearms, and it was take first or lose out. The hunters in the pub packed together and came scrambling towards her like a pack of wolves. Lily knew they would take them all if she didn't put her foot down first. "Listen up. This is for the ones without guns. Let me clarify that," she said with a commanding voice, but the hunters were already digging their hands into the sack of weaponry. She jumped down from the bar and landed quickly so she could stop the hunters, but they were already raiding the sack of guns. She put herself in between them, shoving herself in front of them as more tried to put their greedy, grubby hands into it as well. It had worked, stopping them finally from taking the ones that were left. The rest of the hunters in the back behind them turned around and went back to their seats. One of them stood in front of her, angry and frustrated with her. He held one of the guns along his side, leaning its stock against the floor as if it were a crutch. It was the one he took out a moment before. He seemed disappointed with it, wanting another one from the bag, but Lily shook her head before he could say a word. Then she waved her hand, directing him back to his stool where he had came from, but he didn't move for her. Lily was stunned by his reaction. "Roger, be careful! Let him be!" she said, being concerned for Roger more than herself. The man began to open his fist as two of the pub waitresses stopped serving drinks, watching and waiting what it was. Lily was beside Roger, holding him now. Roger sat there beside the two, keeping to himself as the guy eyeballed Lily as he reached into the pocket of his muddy jeans. She watched him, not knowing what he was going for, but became a bit cautious over it as she backed up a step. The man had a face she had never seen there before and didn't see him with anyone else as she came in. She thought in the back of her mind he could have been an out-of-towner just passing through, but wasn't sure. As he pulled his hand from his jeans, Roger jumped up, putting his hands forcefully against the guy's arm, stopping him, thinking that the man was grabbing a knife or something. "Look! Don't touch me!" he screamed loudly, directed towards Roger. The strange hunter was unknown in this part of town, as the other residents sat in curiosity, wondering who the man was and why he had stopped there. Roger held the man and asked him to leave, but the man hollered again, and even sounded more aggressive this time towards Roger. "I got something, damn it! I want to show her what the hell I have for her!" the strange man replied. Roger gripped the man even tighter along his wrist as the man forced his hand from his and pulled it out. Lily was stunned by his reaction. "Roger, be careful! Let him be," she said, being concerned for Roger more than herself. The man began to open his fist as two of the pub waitresses stopped serving drinks, watching and waiting what it was. Lily was beside Roger, holding him tight now in case the strange outsider did anything shady. As he opened his hand, she could tell his hands were stained and withered and looked unwashed for some time. As he released his fingers, both Lily and Roger could see what it was. It wasn't a knife, as Roger assumed. As Lily came closer to get a better look at his hand, she watched in awe and felt her emotions take a turn as tears began to stream from her eyes. Her eyeliner was dripping now as well as she approached the strange man. She was full of wonder as she watched the tiny object in his hand as she reached for it, wondering how he had it and how had he known. She questioned him as she took it from his rough hands. "Where did you get this? Do I know you?" she said before he could answer her back. The man looked at her, noticing her messy makeup and feeling sorry for her, not knowing anything more than her. Lily could see his angry face had changed and seemed to be more serious now and sincere. "It was given to me. I didn't know him or you. And I didn't mean to frighten you. I'm sorry," he said, seeming much more sincere than earlier. Her tears seemed to stop and she looked puzzled by what he had said. The man had already turned around and began to walk back to where he had been sitting. But before he could make it more than a few feet from her, she asked him, "What do you mean by him? When you said you didn't know him or me?" She was more confused than ever as he looked at her once more. "The man outside wearing overalls and a black cowboy hat had given it to me," the man said as he finished talking. Then he said one last thing as Lily began to cry again. "He told me it was for you and I'd find you in here with guns." The mysterious strange man then walked away from Lily as she stood holding her hand closed over it, crying beside Roger. She was at a loss of words as she curled herself into Roger's side, putting one of her arms around him. Everyone in the tiny pub had turned back to what they were doing before it all happened, losing interest. Roger was already drinking his beer as Lily took another quick peek inside her hand. Nobody else in the room could see as she opened her little fingers. The trinket was that of a glass horse with the rider on top holding his hat out. The horse was white and had brown spots along its head and back, and the rider was wearing a red vest and had a black cowboy hat in his hand. The same color the man said about. The man outside he had retrieved the trinket from. She then understood it wasn't just a man who had given it to him. It was her father. But how? Chapter 17, Frozen to Death. Billy Jones left the basement overwhelmed after finding Tim's body hanging from the rafters. He could feel the coldness swift through his legs as he walked towards the upstairs where his room was. He went to the dresser, opened it, and took another pair of jeans from it, and threw the bloody pair he had on along the floor. He was in a hurry to leave, but needed some heavier clothing. He could feel the weather from inside. It was much colder now than ever before. Ice had formed on the window above the hope chest his friend Tim had given him when he moved in. He went to the closet and ripped a sweater from the hanger, trying to hurry so he could leave as soon as he could. He reached down into the bloody jeans he had taken off just a minute before, the same pair he had worn that day, and grabbed the tiny eagle knick-knack from them. He now had a pair of cargo jeans on, which had more pockets than the last, as he slid the meaningful eagle down into the side pocket of the jeans he had on. He wanted to forget about Tim's corpse hanging in the basement below. He didn't waste much time as he finished dressing, making it back downstairs, as he noticed keys sticking out from beneath one of Tim's dress shoes by the couch. He must have landed on it when he brought the clothes out earlier. Billy had found when he came home. He knew the keys were Tim's, but realized Tim must have parked the car in the garage that day. He didn't see it when he arrived home. That led him to believe that Tim had left. Stupid dumb shit, he said, talking of himself as he walked towards the front door holding the ring of keys. He grabbed the remote for the garage door as he made his way out to the front door. He stood in front of the garage as he pushed a button to open it, but the door seemed to be jammed and stopped just a foot open as it did. He grabbed the door after putting the remote in his back pocket and pushed as hard as he could to raise it. It finally started again and opened until it reached the top. Billy sat the remote down onto the chest of tools as he walked in. The car was inside, but he saw something even better now, and it would be his now that Tim couldn't ride it. The motorcycle was sitting on its kickstand as it shined the way it did when Tim had bought it. He only bought it to piss his wife off. She hated bikes, and this one was fast. The motorcycle was a Ducati, but he wasn't sure what kind. Although he knew how much Tim cherished the bike, it would be in good hands, and Tim wouldn't object if he knew who had it. Billy didn't have the slightest thought where he would go as long as he got far from there. It was the only thing he could think of after seeing what the coldness had done to both Tim and his wife. Starting the bike, he rolled it from the garage using his legs to balance himself. Rolling up beside Tim's wife's car, he could still see her inside sitting lifeless, and he could no longer see her breathing. She hadn't moved any, and her face was now covered in ice that had frozen to her as it formed sharp sickles hanging from her eyelids and lips. Billy dropped the kickstand once more and lifted himself off from the bike as it ran. He walked a step closer and reached into the broken window. Same window he broke earlier with the rock. He wanted to give her one last tap and see if she could communicate with him any. He did so, using his right hand to tap along the back of her frozen head, but she didn't say anything. He tried tapping a second time, barely slipping on the cold concreted driveway. Trying for a last time, he reached in. As he reached to tap her, the back of her neck began to crackle and rip as her head snapped forward and hit the steering wheel. In that instant, her body was now leaving fresh ice and blood spewing out towards him, covering the driver's side window where she was in his hand. Billy slipped backwards in fright, smacking the ground as he kicked his legs to get up by the Ducati. The horn in her car had been pressed and blaring into the night as he got up onto the bike, kicking the stand back into place and driving off. Ripping in lethal speeds, the bike and Billy were like one as they raced along Shawl Road. He didn't have a helmet on and was cold as he gripped the throttle with the hand her blood had just spurted on. The thought of it and the nightmare he was in almost made him gag as he tore into the open road. A few miles down, just before he reached the Blanche's Lane, he could see a strange kid up ahead of him walking towards the road. He was carrying something and seemed to be coming from Jimmy's house. The strange kid had ran through Jimmy's front lawn as he walked to the other side of the road. Billy's headlight on the bike was directed at him as he noticed the odd boy running for the woods across from Jimmy's house. The stranger seemed to dive into the heaviness of the wooded area, surrounded by frozen trees and wild plants of all sorts. Things weren't adding up for Billy as he slowed the Ducati as it hummed, letting out a small amount of smoke from the back. Billy let off the throttle and turned into the Blanches' driveway. The lane was free for the most part, and the only car there was Jimmy's, Dad's, and it was parked up top by the house. Billy left the bike after turning it off to save gas. Deciding to walk up to the house where Jimmy lived, he approached the car Jimmy's father owned, but nobody was inside. The screen door was still out on the lawn like earlier, but the storm door on the house seemed to be intact and shut. Billy made his way up to the deck and put his hand onto one of the beams that supported the roof of it. Taking another look around for the strange boy he had noticed in his headlight a few minutes before, he seen nothing. He then turned again and back towards the front of the house and gave the door a light knock, waiting where he heard nothing, no sounds of life, not inside, not out. Billy knocked again, but harder and much more physical as the door creaked open, giving him a view of the living room. "Mr. Blanche, are you there?" He called out into the openness of the large room full of decorative pieces Jimmy's mother had left when she moved in with her boyfriend. The room had a putrid smell as Billy entered into the room, holding a sweater over his nose and mouth. The horrible scent was strong and caused him to gasp even behind it, as he called again to see if Mr. Blanche was home or inside. "Mr. Blanche!" But he received nothing back. Nobody was there unless they couldn't hear him. Billy was trespassing and a bit worried being there, not knowing if he was alone. He needed to talk to Jimmy's father about the strange boy he had seen running from there. Walking into the next room, which was that of an office, he could see a picture in a glass frame sitting on the desk. It sat there just ahead of him as he went to it and lifted it to examine who was in the shot. It was Jimmy's parents the day they were married. Jimmy was in it too, holding his mother. They looked really happy. Jimmy had a cheesy smile and he was missing one of his front teeth. Jimmy's father was in a white tuxedo and had his hair combed neatly. His wife also looked happy and had on a pair of long dangling earrings and looked kind of fake. Hair was up inside one of those bride's things that they wear on that special day. Sitting the photo back, he could still smell that awful smell coming into the room he was in. It too, to him, smelled like sulfur or something of that nature. He couldn't put his mind around it. It wasn't distinct, but it was disgusting and made him sick as he stood looking around. From behind the desk, he watched from the window and could see how dark the night was getting. The strange boy was gone. He didn't see anything but Tim's Ducati out at the bottom of the lane. Billy turned and left from the office room, needing to use the restroom. He had held it in and needed to go badly. Opening the next door over, he noticed another room full of office junk and boxes. It must have been for storage. He walked along the hallway to the second floor, which didn't have a handle. It was the kind you slide open. As Billy slid open the door, he quickly closed it again as he jumped backwards, surprised by what he had seen. Jimmy's father was laying along the floor, face down. He didn't know if he was hurt or drunk, but he could see blood on the back of Mr. Blanche's white work shirt, which had stripes across it. Thinking he could help, he opened the door and got down to see if he was alive, but he wasn't. He could see the blood bubbling up from his shirt, noticing there were strange pinholes ripped into it. The holes were small and looked as if somebody stuck him in the back with something and drained his blood. Billy could also see a hand streak of blood across the dead man's shoulder. The pattern of a hand as if he struggled with somebody trying to get them off of him. The fingerprints were useless, though the town had become one for all and all for none as of late. Mansfield had become overrun with mindless yet cold-blooded and murderous vigilantes. Billy stepped over the body to relieve himself, and was certain there was much more death to come. Chapter 18. Moving in the Night.